The auction yard buzzed with life beneath the blazing midday sun. The heat pressed down like an iron blanket, its relentless rays bouncing off the dry, dusty planks of the old wooden fences. The atmosphere was electric. Buyers and sellers moved with purpose, voices rising and falling in a symphony of negotiations and appraisals. From all corners of the region, ranchers had brought their finest horses to this annual livestock auction in Mesa Creek, Texas, hoping to fetch high prices and strike favorable deals. Among the sea of wide-brimmed hats, crisp denim, and worn leather boots, the air crackled with anticipation. Horses were paraded through holding pens, their manes groomed, their muscles rippling under glossy coats. Buyers, clutching notebooks and sipping iced coffee from paper cups, squinted into the sun as they eyed each animal like a precious commodity. Some murmured observations into their cell phones. Others scribbled hurried notes, already calculating profits and pedigree potential. "Look at the way that stallion moves," a man in a navy vest said, nodding toward a glossy black thoroughbred trotting in the ring. "Strong chest. He's bred for power," another added, tipping his hat. Each prized horse drew whispers and admiration, some even applause. But tucked away in the farthest pen, away from the spotlight and crowd excitement, stood a creature no one cared to notice. In a narrow, weather-worn pen, barely shaded from the oppressive sun, stood a fragile horse. His head hung low, ears limp, and his coat, once chestnut perhaps, was now dull and matted with dirt. Ribs jutted out in sharp relief, and his legs looked barely able to support the frail weight of his body. Buyers didn't even glance his way. A few who did spared only scorn. "That one's a ghost," a tall man in snakeskin boots muttered with a shake of his head. "Wouldn't pull a wheelbarrow. Probably dragged here out of pity," another laughed. "He's headed for the meat plant, that's for sure." The horse didn't react. His sunken eyes betrayed no fear, no hope, just a quiet surrender. It was the look of an animal that had long accepted its fate, accustomed to being ignored, discarded, and unseen. Then, cutting through the crowd, came someone different. A young woman moved slowly and steadily toward the forgotten pen. Her name was Natalie Brooks, a third-generation rancher from Pine Hollow, a small rural town an hour away. Her light brown hair was braided tightly down her back, and she wore a dusty white t-shirt tucked into faded jeans, the cuffs of which were frayed and stained. Her boots had clearly walked hundreds of miles of ranch land. Slung over her shoulder was a leather satchel worn from use, inside of which rested her entire savings. Money earned from months of labor on her family's modest ranch. She walked with quiet confidence, her eyes sharp and searching. She paused now and then at pens holding well-bred horses, admiring their strength, but moving on quickly. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind, something he'd told her years ago while teaching her how to train her first pony. "Never judge a horse by its hide. Look deeper. A heart can't be seen. It has to be felt." As Natalie drifted near the back corner of the stockyard, her steps slowed. Something had caught her attention. She stopped at the pen no one else had looked at twice. The stillness of the sickly horse, the way he stood as if waiting for nothing, stirred something deep in her chest. She stepped closer, ignoring the snickering voices behind her. "What in the world are you doing over there?" someone called out with a chuckle. Natalie didn't respond. She rested her palms gently on the weathered wood of the fence, leaning in slightly. "Hey there," she whispered to the horse. Her voice was soft, almost musical. "What's your story, boy?" The horse didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he lifted his head just enough for their eyes to meet. In that quiet, weighty moment, Natalie saw something unexpected. Not just sadness, but a flicker of longing. A deeply buried ember of willpower, not yet extinguished. Natalie stood motionless for a few seconds, her hands still gripping the fence as her eyes remained locked with the horses. The world around them, the bustle, the laughter, the auctioneer's voice rising over a loudspeaker, faded into a distant hum. In that moment, nothing else existed. Just her, and this forgotten animal who had already been judged, dismissed, and sentenced in everyone else's mind. "What caught your eye about that bag of bones?" a nearby bidder sneered. A heavy-set man in a plaid shirt and oversized belt buckle. He sauntered over with a smug grin. Natalie didn't look away. "That's none of your concern," she replied, her tone calm but firm. The man raised an eyebrow. "Suit yourself," he said with a shrug, turning back toward the crowd. "Some folks never learn." Ignoring him, Natalie extended her hand toward the horse slowly, with the kind of patience that only comes from years spent around skittish animals. The horse flinched slightly, muscles tensing beneath his dust-caked coat. But he didn't bolt. After a moment, he leaned forward just enough for his muzzle to touch her fingertips. The contact was fleeting, but it was enough. Natalie's heart squeezed. That single touch sealed her decision. When the auctioneer eventually reached the forgotten horse, his voice noticeably dropped in energy. The booming pride he had used for showier animals was gone, replaced by a dull, half-hearted pitch. "All right, folks," he drawled into the mic. "We got a younger gelding here. Needs some TLC. Maybe someone out there's got a soft spot or a spare pasture." Laughter trickled through the crowd. Some turned away. Others chuckled and muttered cruel remarks under their breath. No hands went up. "I'll take him," Natalie said. The words cut through the noise like thunder. Heads turned. Whispers broke out. A few people laughed out loud, thinking it was some kind of joke. "You've got to be kidding," a woman scoffed from near the concession booth. "What are you going to do with that thing? Let him fall apart in your barn." But Natalie had already started moving toward the auctioneer. She didn't flinch, didn't respond to the comments. Her feet were steady, and her voice even. "What's the price?" she asked the auctioneer directly. He blinked in surprise, as if struggling to comprehend that someone genuinely wanted the horse. Minimum bid will do," he said after a moment, scratching his chin. "It's not much, just enough to cover transport and the pen fee." Without hesitation, Natalie reached into her leather satchel and pulled out the money. Her hands didn't shake. She handed the crumpled bills to the clerk, nodding once when the sale was confirmed. "Sold," the auctioneer said, more relieved than pleased. To the young lady in the boots. As the murmurs swelled around her, Natalie walked back toward the pen with quiet purpose. She took the lead rope and gently fastened it to the halter around the horse's neck. Then she leaned close, her voice soft as a whisper. "From now on, your name's Maverick," she murmured. "And no one's going to look past you ever again." Maverick didn't resist. He didn't understand what was happening yet, but he didn't shy away either. As they walked away from the yard, past wagging heads and dismissive grins, Natalie didn't glance back. "She's out of her mind," someone called. "She's gonna regret it," another snorted. Maybe, maybe not. But as Natalie walked beside the frail horse, her steps remained strong. Inside her stirred a mix of nervous energy and unshakable conviction. She didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but she knew this. She had seen something in that horse no one else had, and she wasn't about to let that go. The sun hung lower in the sky as Natalie and Maverick left the auction yard behind, walking along a winding dirt road that led into the Texas countryside. The dust kicked up lightly with each of their steps, the soft crunch of gravel beneath worn-out boots and hooves barely audible over the distant chirping of cicadas. Maverick moved slowly. His steps were uneven, and his thin legs trembled under the strain of each pace. Natalie watched him closely, stopping every few minutes to let him rest. She didn't say much, there was no need. Instead, she walked quietly at his side, her hand gently resting on the lead rope, her presence offering reassurance that he was no longer alone. "Take it easy, boy," she whispered at one point, brushing his sweat-soaked neck. "You're safe now. We're almost home." The trail that led to her family's ranch was long and largely untraveled, bordered by dry grass fields and the occasional patch of wind-stirred mesquite. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry echoing across the open land. The landscape stretched out endlessly, golden under the fading sunlight. It was peaceful, but to Natalie, every step felt heavier than the last. She had taken a huge gamble. Most of her savings had gone into buying Maverick, a horse everyone else had deemed worthless. The ridicule from the auction still rang in her ears, the chuckles, the side comments, the certainty that she had made a foolish mistake. But the more she looked at Maverick, the more certain she became that they hadn't seen what she had. There was something in his eyes. It wasn't just pain, it was patience. The patience of someone who had waited a long time to be seen. As the road curved around the last bend, Natalie finally caught sight of home. The ranch was modest. A small wooden house, a two-stall barn, and a fenced-in corral that looked like it could use some repairs. The front porch sagged just slightly, shaded by an old oak tree that had stood longer than Natalie had been alive. On the porch sat her grandfather, Walt Brooks, his weathered hands polishing a rusted tool. His white hair peeked out from under a straw hat, and his eyes, still sharp despite the years, narrowed as he spotted her approaching with the frail horse in tow. Walt stood slowly, resting one hand on his knee and the other on the porch railing. "What's with the horse?" he asked, his voice tinged with equal parts curiosity and concern. Natalie stopped a few feet from the steps. She took a deep breath before answering. "He's mine, Grandpa," she said, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "I bought him." Walt looked the horse up and down, his brow furrowing. He stepped down from the porch and approached Maverick with the careful eye of someone who had spent a lifetime reading animals. He circled the horse once, noting the protruding ribs, the dull eyes, and the sluggish movements. "Skin and bones," he muttered. "Looks like he hasn't had a full meal in weeks." Natalie nodded, standing tall even as uncertainty fluttered in her chest. "I know, but I think he can come back from this. He just needs care, and someone who believes in him." Her grandfather exhaled, folding his arms across his chest. "Takes more than food to bring a horse back from this kind of shape, Natalie. Takes time, patience, hard work. You ready for that?" "I am," she said, no hesitation in her voice. Walt watched her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "All right then. He's yours. You feed him. You train him. You take full responsibility." Natalie smiled, grateful, relieved, and still nervous all at once. "Thank you, Grandpa." He gestured toward the paddock. "Put him in the smaller pen for tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Natalie led Maverick to a makeshift shelter she had quickly prepped the night before, just in case she came home with a rescue. She untied the rope and gave him a moment to get used to his surroundings. The horse didn't move right away. He simply turned his head and looked at her. His dark eyes lingered, studying her, as if trying to understand what had just happened. Natalie crouched beside the fence and pulled out a bucket of fresh water she had prepared earlier. "Here you go, big guy. You earned this," she said gently. Maverick drank with desperate thirst, his whole body seeming to loosen as the cool water flowed through him. Afterward, she brought him some hay, sitting cross-legged nearby as he chewed slowly. Now, in the quiet of their new beginning, Natalie saw how truly thin he was. But beyond the fragile body, there was something else, a spark. The way he lifted his head, the cautious way he watched his new home, spoke of a resilience that hadn't yet given up. That evening, when Walt came out to check on them, he found Natalie curled up on a blanket near the fence, already fast asleep. Maverick stood beside her, his ears tilted forward, his gaze steady and calm, as if keeping watch over the only person who had ever believed in him. Walt smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Maybe you're right about him, girl." Then, turning back toward the house, he left them there. Two souls at the beginning of a journey neither of them would face alone. The following morning, the rising sun cast long golden beams across the ranch. A warm breeze rustled through the trees, and the distant sound of roosters crowing echoed across the fields. Natalie was already up, rubbing sleep from her eyes as she stepped outside, her boots crunching softly against the dirt. Maverick stood quietly in the small paddock, head lowered, tail flicking occasionally at flies. He looked slightly better than he had the day before, but only just. His body still sagged with exhaustion, his steps slow and uncertain. But Natalie noticed something different in his eyes that morning. A faint glint, a trace of awareness. She carried over a clean bucket of water and a small bundle of hay mixed with supplements, vitamins, alfalfa pellets, and a bit of molasses to entice his appetite. She placed the feed down carefully and crouched nearby. "Come on, boy," she encouraged gently. "It's all for you." Maverick sniffed at the food warily before taking a few tentative bites. Natalie smiled with quiet relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Her days quickly settled into a rhythm. Mornings began before sunrise with Maverick's feeding and cleaning, followed by short moments of companionship. Natalie didn't rush him. She didn't expect sudden miracles. She simply showed up, day after day, with soft words, clean water, and quiet patience. She talked to him constantly, sharing stories about the ranch, her family, and her dreams. Not because she expected him to understand, but because her voice, steady and familiar, seemed to bring him comfort. "You're not just some lost cause," she'd say as she brushed him gently. "You matter here, and we're gonna prove it." At first, Maverick barely responded to her touch. He flinched easily, especially around his flanks and legs, which told Natalie more than she wanted to know about the life he had led before. Someone had hurt him, not just physically, but in a way that left deep emotional scars. When she tried to lead him toward the larger corral one morning, he froze. His muscles locked, his eyes widened, and he refused to move another step. Natalie dropped the rope gently, not pulling. Instead, she sat down in the dirt beside him, letting the tension dissipate. From the porch, Walt watched the scene unfold, leaning against his cane. After a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice even but laced with the weight of experience. "That horse is broken on the inside," he said plainly. "Not just tired or hungry. He's scared of what comes next. His mind's still trapped wherever he came from." Natalie didn't look away from Maverick. "Then we'll fix him," she replied. "But we'll do it on his time, not ours." That day, she didn't lead him any further. She just stayed with him near the gate. No pressure, no commands, just presence. And that presence made all the difference. By the third day, Maverick took 2 steps forward on his own. On the fourth, he made it through the gate without freezing. Every inch he moved was a victory, not just for him but for her, too. Progress was slow and uneven. Some days he seemed more confident. Other days, his old fears returned, keeping him rooted in place. But Natalie never gave up. She celebrated the small wins, like the first time he nudged her hand, or when he let her run a brush down his legs without flinching. The ranch became a sanctuary, not just for healing his body, but for rebuilding his trust. Natalie knew he had a long road ahead, but her heart swelled with every tiny step forward. "Easy now," she murmured one afternoon as she stroked his withers. "You're not in the dark anymore, Maverick. You're home." And with each passing day, that statement felt more and more true. As the days turned into weeks, Maverick began to change. But not in the dramatic way people expect when they hear the word rescue. His transformation wasn't sudden or showy. It was quiet, slow, the kind of change that took root beneath the surface, barely visible unless you were really looking. Natalie was always looking. Every morning before breakfast, she walked out to the paddock, sometimes with fresh carrots in her pocket, other times just with a brush and a quiet presence. Maverick would greet her now, not with excitement, but with something even better, calmness. He no longer shied away when she approached. He watched her with those dark eyes that now held a flicker of recognition, maybe even anticipation. He was starting to trust her. But regaining physical strength was another matter entirely. In the early stages, Natalie focused on helping Maverick move again, carefully, patiently. She began by walking him slowly around the paddock, one circle at a time, watching his hooves closely for any signs of pain or instability. His legs were still weak, his stride uneven, and sometimes he would stop mid-step as if the memory of pain lingered longer than the injury itself. "There's no race here," she would say softly. "Just you and me." Walt often stood by the fence with a mug of coffee in hand, observing. At first, he remained skeptical, arms folded as he watched them shuffle back and forth in the dust. "You're babying him too much," he warned one morning. "He needs to be pushed a little or he'll stay broken." Natalie didn't argue. She just kept working. She knew what she was doing wasn't traditional. She wasn't training him like one would a show horse or a ranch workhorse. She wasn't breaking him. She was earning him step by careful step. Each session was short. Each rest break was long. She never used a whip or raised her voice. Instead, she spoke in steady tones, offering comfort and encouragement as they moved together. At first, even short walks tired Maverick out. His chest would heave, sweat soaking his patchy coat after only a few minutes of slow trotting. But each day he lasted a little longer. Each week his strides became steadier, and gradually something began to shift. Not just in his body, but in his spirit. There was a moment, one Natalie would remember for the rest of her life, that marked a turning point. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the corral. Maverick had just finished a short walk and was resting at the edge of the fence when Natalie walked into the center and crouched down. She didn't call him. She didn't wave. But Maverick walked to her. No hesitation. No fear. He crossed the corral slowly and stopped just inches from her, lowering his head until his muzzle touched her shoulder. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a message. He trusted her. Tears welled in Natalie's eyes, but she didn't move. She let him stand there, resting his tired head against her, as the wind stirred the grass and a hawk cried in the sky. From the porch, Walt watched with a thoughtful expression, his earlier doubts slowly giving way to something else. Something quieter, maybe even admiration. The next morning, Natalie stood at the edge of the paddock with a worn halter slung over her shoulder and a small pouch of apple slices in her hand. Maverick stood just a few yards away, his head lifted as he watched her. His ears twitched forward, not in fear, but curiosity. "All right, big guy," she said with a gentle smile. "Let's try something new today." Up until now, they'd stuck to simple walking exercises, letting Maverick rebuild muscle and balance in slow, careful movements. But Natalie had noticed lately that he seemed restless, stronger. His legs didn't tremble the way they used to. His coat had begun to recover its sheen, and he now carried himself with a cautious but growing confidence. She opened the gate and led him into the larger corral, wide enough for a short run, but still enclosed and safe. Walt was already leaning on the far rail, his cane resting nearby. "You're going to let him move free?" he asked. Natalie nodded. "I think he's ready, and I think he needs it." Walt didn't argue this time. Once inside, she unclipped the lead rope and stepped back. Maverick stood still for a moment, processing the open space around him. His chest rose and fell, muscles tense. "You're free, Maverick," she said softly. "Go ahead." And for a moment it seemed like he might not move. Then he did. With a sudden burst of motion that caught Natalie off guard, Maverick took off. Awkwardly at first, like a colt learning to run. His strides were uneven, his hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as he surged forward in a rough, unsure rhythm. But then something amazing happened. He found his pace. His head lifted, his stride stretched. His muscles, though still lean, rippled with effort as he galloped a full circle around the corral. The wind caught his mane. His tail streamed behind him. And in that moment, for the first time since Natalie had seen him in that forgotten pen, Maverick looked like a horse again. Not broken, not discarded, not forgotten. Alive. Natalie felt her chest tighten, her eyes stinging with tears. She leaned on the fence, her knuckles white as she watched him run. Walt let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be." When Maverick finally slowed to a trot and then to a walk, he approached Natalie, panting, his sides heaving but his eyes alight. She reached out, her palm against his warm forehead. "You still got it," she whispered, brushing her hand along his neck. From that day forward, their routine expanded. Natalie began incorporating strength training, gentle hill walks, stretching, and longer trots. She adjusted his feeding plan with the help of a local vet, adding nutrients to rebuild muscle and energy. Walt, who had once stood at a distance, now joined them regularly. Sometimes he'd hand Natalie tools or offer pointers from his decades of experience. Other times, he'd bring an old curry comb and help brush Maverick down after their sessions. "This one reminds me of Buck," he said one afternoon as he worked the brush along Maverick's side. "Same fire, same stubborn streak. Buck wouldn't let a soul touch him for weeks after I brought him home." "What changed?" Natalie asked. Walt smiled, a little distant. "I stopped trying to break him and started trying to listen." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the sky lit up in shades of coral and lavender, Natalie sat in the pasture while Maverick grazed nearby. The stars began to appear, one by one, and a warm breeze carried the smell of fresh hay across the field. She leaned back in the grass, her hands behind her head, and whispered into the night, "We're gonna get there, Maverick. One step, one gallop, one day at a time." The progress Maverick had made in just a few months was nothing short of remarkable. His coat now gleamed under the sun, rich and coppery with health. The ribs that once protruded like broken piano keys had softened under layers of new muscle. But more importantly, his spirit, once crushed beneath a lifetime of neglect, was rising. Yet Natalie knew that if they were ever going to move beyond the paddock, there was one step they could no longer avoid: the saddle. It had been waiting for weeks, hanging in the barn like a silent question. Natalie had passed by it many times, running her hand along the worn leather as if asking it for patience. She didn't want to rush this. Trust, once built, could be shattered in a second. But it was time. One crisp morning, Natalie led Maverick into the training corral. The air smelled like cedar and fresh hay, and a faint mist clung to the tips of the grass. Walt stood by the gate, his arms folded, a saddle blanket draped over one shoulder. "You sure he's ready for this?" he asked, not with doubt but concern. "No," Natalie admitted, "but we have to try." She began the process with care, letting Maverick sniff the blanket. He did, nostrils flaring, but didn't step away. That was a good sign. Next, she gently laid the blanket across his back. He twitched but stayed still. "Good boy," she murmured. Then came the saddle. She brought it out slowly, letting him see it, feel its weight in her hands, hear the creak of the leather. She rubbed it against his neck and shoulders without fastening anything, letting him become familiar with the scent and feel. Only then did she attempt to lay it across his back. Maverick stiffened instantly. His ears went back. His tail flicked hard. "It's okay," Natalie whispered, her hand on his neck. "I'm here. No one's going to hurt you." For a long moment he remained frozen. Then, to her relief, he settled. Not relaxed, but not fleeing either. Walt stepped closer, holding out the cinch strap. "Want a hand?" "Yeah," Natalie said, her voice low. Together, they worked the saddle into place. Natalie moved with slow precision, buckling the strap with as little pressure as possible. She kept talking the whole time, not about the saddle but about ordinary things. The chickens escaping their coop, the hay bale that nearly rolled into the creek. Her words were a lifeline, anchoring Maverick to the present. When everything was secure, she stepped back. "That's it," she said softly. "You're wearing it." Maverick shifted uneasily but didn't panic. He took one step, then two. His gait was awkward, uncertain, like he was trying to figure out what had changed about his body. Natalie led him around the corral in slow circles. Walt walked beside them, offering guidance when needed. Finally, after half an hour of adjustment, Maverick moved naturally again. Natalie stopped him, resting her hand on his warm shoulder. "You did it, buddy. I'm so proud of you." That evening, as she unsaddled him and brushed him down, Maverick turned his head and gently bumped her arm with his nose. It was his way of saying thank you. In that quiet moment under the fading amber sky, Natalie felt something shift again. Not just in Maverick, but in her. She was no longer the girl who had brought home a hopeless cause. She was the partner of a horse who had decided to fight his way back into the world. The saddle no longer frightened him. For several days, Natalie continued their training routine with the saddle secured firmly on Maverick's back. She didn't rush. Every day was about consistency, comfort, and quiet encouragement. If Maverick hesitated, she waited. If he flinched, she backed off. But most of the time, he didn't. Instead, he seemed to grow calmer beneath the familiar weight of the saddle. By the end of the week, Natalie knew it was time for the next big step. Riding. The idea stirred a nervous energy in her chest. She had ridden dozens of horses in her life, some wild, some tame, but none had carried the weight of meaning that Maverick did. This wasn't just a ride. This was a test of everything they had built together. Trust, connection, and mutual courage. That morning, as she led him into the open corral, the sun was just beginning to warm the cool air. A soft breeze drifted across the ranch, carrying the faint scent of pine and morning dew. Walt stood by the gate, arms crossed, watching with the kind of quiet tension that comes from years of knowing how much can go wrong, and how much can go right. "You sure about this?" he asked, handing her the old leather reins. "As sure as I'll ever be," Natalie replied. She began as always, guiding Maverick slowly in circles, the saddle already cinched snug across his back. He moved with ease now, responding to her soft voice and the gentle tug of the lead. When he seemed fully at ease, she stopped him near the fence. She took a deep breath. Then she stepped onto the mounting block, one hand on the horn of the saddle, one foot in the stirrup. "Okay, Maverick," she said gently. "This is it." With slow, deliberate motion, she swung her leg over and settled into the saddle. Maverick froze. Every muscle in his body tightened like a coiled spring. His ears flicked backward, and he shifted uncomfortably under the new weight. Natalie stayed perfectly still, not urging him forward, not applying pressure, just being there, quietly. "You're okay?" she whispered, running her hand along his neck. "I'm right here." Seconds passed. Then a minute. Slowly, Maverick's breathing eased. His stance softened. And then he took a step. Cautious, unsteady step. Then another. Natalie let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That's it," she murmured. "You're doing it." Walt watched from the fence, his face unreadable. But when Maverick completed a full lap around the corral without panicking, he nodded once. "Didn't think I'd see the day," he said. Neither did Natalie, not this soon. Over the next few days, they built on that small victory. Each ride grew a little longer, a little more confident. Maverick began to respond to Natalie's signals. Not perfectly, but willingly. And every time she dismounted, she did so with reverence, patting his side and whispering a thank you as if he had carried not just her weight, but her hope. The first time they trotted together, Maverick stumbled a little, but recovered quickly. Natalie laughed, her joy spilling into the morning air like music. "You're getting the hang of this, partner." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in dusky golds and violets, Natalie sat beside Maverick in the pasture, her back against the fence, knees pulled to her chest. "You were never broken," she whispered. "You just needed time. Someone to believe." Maverick, lying in the grass nearby, flicked his ear toward her voice. He didn't need to move, didn't need to nuzzle her or make a sound. They understood each other now, and that was enough. By late summer, the transformation was undeniable. Maverick now moved with grace and power. His once fragile legs carried him with newfound confidence, and his coat, now rich and glossy, shimmered beneath the Texas sun. Neighbors who had once rolled their eyes at Natalie's gamble began stopping by the ranch to watch her work with him. Some brought apples, others brought curiosity, but all left with awe. "You'd never believe he was the same horse?" one neighbor murmured, watching Maverick canter across the paddock. Natalie always smiled politely, but deep down, she never forgot how those same people had looked at him, at her at the auction. Their doubt still lingered like a ghost behind every compliment. Walt, too, had changed. He no longer stood at a distance with crossed arms and skeptical glances. Now he helped tack Maverick up each morning, handed Natalie a water bottle during their long rides, and occasionally sat with her on the porch at sunset, swapping stories about the horses he'd raised in his youth. "You did something special here," he said one evening as they watched Maverick graze peacefully beneath the old oak tree. But now comes the hard part. Natalie glanced over, eyebrows raised. Harder than this? Reckon so, he said with a nod. You've brought him back. Now you gotta show him off. She didn't respond right away. Competing had never been the point, at least not in the beginning. When she first saw Maverick in that neglected pen, all she had wanted was to save him, to give him a chance. But now he was ready, and deep in her gut, she knew it wasn't just about proving something to others anymore. It was about proving something to themselves. That night, she sat by the fireplace, flipping through a calendar of upcoming local equestrian events. Most were small. A few were even labeled novice-friendly. Her finger stopped at one in particular, a beginner's course just an hour away. No huge crowds, no elite competitors, just a place to start. She circled the date. The following weeks were filled with preparation. Natalie adjusted Maverick's training routine, incorporating tighter turns, low jumps, and unfamiliar obstacles to simulate what they'd face in competition. She played crowd noise on her phone, let him see flags flapping in the wind, even brought in friends and family to act as mock spectators. At first, Maverick reacted with nerves. He tensed at the sound of applause, snorted at banners, shied away from colorful cones. But Natalie never scolded. She rewarded each moment of courage, each brave step forward, with calm praise and gentle touches. You've already won, Maverick, she whispered one morning, brushing his coat after a long session. This is just the next adventure. When the day of the competition arrived, the air buzzed with nerves and excitement. Natalie woke early, brushed Maverick until his coat gleamed like burnished copper, and loaded him into the trailer with care. As they pulled into the fairgrounds, Natalie's heart beat hard in her chest. Dozens of other riders were already there, some in crisp uniforms, their horses stepping with polished confidence. The field was dotted with jump courses, warm-up areas, and white tents flapping in the breeze. Maverick stepped out of the trailer and froze. His ears flicked. His eyes scanned the chaos. The noise, the movement, the unfamiliarity. It all pressed in at once. Natalie stepped beside him, placing a steady hand on his neck. It's okay, she whispered. I've got you. He didn't bolt. He didn't rear. He just stood still, trusting her voice, trusting her presence. They were ready. The fairground buzzed with energy. Riders paced nervously, adjusting tack and murmuring last-minute encouragement to their horses. Spectators filled the wooden bleachers, sipping coffee, snapping photos, and chatting animatedly beneath the mid-morning sun. Natalie stood beside Maverick in the warm-up ring. He shifted beneath her, uneasy but not panicked. His muscles were tense, his eyes wide, taking in the flags, the bright poles, and the unfamiliar shapes of other horses and riders in motion. Easy, buddy, she murmured, running her hand down his neck. Just you and me, like always. Walt watched from the edge of the arena, leaning on the fence, his hat tilted low against the sun. His face was unreadable, but Natalie knew he was proud. He hadn't said much that morning, just handed her a water bottle and gave Maverick a nod. Make em remember him, he'd said quietly. As her number was called over the loudspeaker, Natalie took a deep breath. This was it. She mounted with practiced ease and guided Maverick to the entrance gate. The course ahead was a modest jump set, 6 obstacles in total, none more than 2.5 feet high. For most riders, it was routine, but for Natalie, it was monumental. The gatekeeper gave her a nod. Number 31, Natalie Brooks and Maverick, the announcer called out. Applause rippled from the stands. She nudged Maverick forward. He hesitated for a split second, then stepped into the arena. The crowd fell quiet as they crossed the starting line. Maverick's ears swiveled back at first, uncertain. Natalie leaned forward slightly in the saddle, her voice low and steady. You've got this, Maverick. Trust me. The first jump came quickly, a simple vertical. Maverick cleared it, awkward but clean. Natalie's heart jumped in her chest. They continued to the next, a small oxer. He approached with more confidence this time, his stride lengthening. And again clean. The crowd began to stir. The third jump was painted in bright red and white. Maverick balked for a heartbeat, then surged forward and cleared it. The landing was a little rough, but Natalie kept him steady. 3 more to go. They approached a line of 2 verticals. Maverick clipped the pole on the first, but it stayed up. By the second, he moved with rhythm, energy building in his stride. Then came the final obstacle. A simple crossrail framed by banners flapping in the breeze. Maverick's ears pinned back. His eyes widened. Natalie tightened the reins slightly, not to command, but to remind him. "I'm here. Let's go," she whispered. He leapt. The crowd gasped, and he cleared it. As they crossed the finish line, applause broke out. Not thunderous, but warm, surprised, respectful. Natalie slowed Maverick to a walk, leaning forward to pat his neck. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Walt met them at the gate, his eyes shining beneath the brim of his hat. "Kid," he said, helping her down from the saddle. "That horse isn't just healed. He's something special." Natalie didn't need a ribbon to know that. They had already won. The day after the competition, something shifted. Maverick's clean run, while not flawless, had drawn attention. Not just from spectators, but from people who mattered in the equestrian world. By the time Natalie and Walt arrived back at the ranch, there were already a handful of voicemails on the landline. And the next morning, 2 strangers were waiting by the front gate in a shiny black SUV. Walt frowned as he walked up to greet them, Natalie a few steps behind, still brushing the dust off her jeans. One of the men stepped forward, extending a hand and flashing a polished smile. "Ms. Brooks? My name's Robert Langston. I represent Green Hollow Stables, just north of Austin." Natalie shook his hand cautiously. "Okay. We saw your run yesterday," he said. "Very impressive. That horse of yours, he's got something. Fire. Focus. People noticed." Natalie stayed quiet. Robert continued. "We're prepared to offer you a significant sum for him. A clean transfer. Full vet support. Boarding covered. And, if you're interested, opportunities for you to ride professionally under our banner." Walt didn't move, but the lines in his jaw tightened. Natalie exhaled slowly. "How much?" $75,000 to start," Robert said confidently. "More if he performs again at regionals. That's more than most horses of his age and unknown pedigree ever fetch." Natalie glanced at Maverick, grazing quietly in the paddock just a few yards away. His ears twitched, his coat still gleaming from the day before. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but he's not for sale." Robert's smile faltered just slightly. "You sure? That money could get you 3 more horses. Or your own training facility. A future." She met his gaze squarely. "He is my future." He tried again. "Ms. Brooks, I know you're attached, but emotions don't pay for feed. Don't fix fences. This is a business, and horses like him, they're rare. Don't let that opportunity slip." Natalie's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "He's not a product. He's not leverage. He's not a tool to elevate my brand. Maverick is my partner. We didn't come this far for me to sell him off like a used saddle." Silence fell between them. Finally, Robert gave a shallow nod. "I understand. If you change your mind." "I won't," Natalie cut in. The men left without further protest. That evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, Natalie sat in the paddock with Maverick beside her, his head resting loosely over the fence rail. "You're not for sale," she whispered. "Not now. Not ever." Walt approached from the barn, a quiet pride in his step. "You did the right thing," he said. "I know," Natalie replied, and she did, because the story they were writing together wasn't one of fame or fast money. It was one of loyalty, of second chances, of choosing heart over headline. Months passed. Autumn painted the Texas landscape in deep amber and warm rust. Leaves rustled across the ranch trails, and the air carried the scent of firewood and hay. Life settled into a steady rhythm for Natalie and Maverick. Not one of complacency, but of confidence. They kept training, They kept competing. They kept growing together. Though they didn't win every ribbon, their story began to spread. The girl who bought a forgotten horse at an auction, and the bond that turned him into a champion of spirit. Maverick's presence began to attract visitors. Young riders came to the ranch for lessons. Families brought their children to pet the famous copper-coated horse who once stood invisible in a dusty pen. And with every gentle nudge of his nose, every slow blink of trust, Maverick changed more than just Natalie's life. He began to change others, too. One bright Saturday, as a group of children took turns brushing his coat, a boy of about 7 lingered behind the others. He approached slowly, shyly, his hand trembling as he reached out toward Maverick's flank. "Is it true no one wanted him?" he asked quietly. Natalie crouched beside him. "Yes," she said gently, "but he wasn't worthless. People just didn't look hard enough." The boy pressed his palm against Maverick's warm side. The horse didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into the touch, slowly, as if saying, "You matter, too." Later that evening, Natalie sat on the porch, a notebook in her lap. Walt had given it to her a few weeks back, suggesting she write down everything. "Not for the world," he said, "but for the next soul who thinks a broken thing isn't worth saving." And so she had. She wrote about the auction, about the hunger and the heartbreak, about the first time Maverick touched her hand, and the first time he ran. She wrote about the moments of doubt and the louder moments of hope. When she finished, she closed the notebook and titled the cover with a black marker, "Maverick, the horse who taught me to believe." She didn't expect it to become anything more than a keepsake. But after a friend read it, and then a neighbor, and then a local newspaper published an excerpt, the story spread. Not fast, not viral, but real, personal, resonant. Eventually, Natalie self-published the book. To her surprise, it touched thousands. And Maverick, no longer the forgotten horse, became a symbol of something bigger, the power of faith, the strength of second chances, the healing found in unseen bonds. Years later, after Maverick had retired from competitions, he lived out his days under the same oak tree near the paddock. Children still came to visit. Natalie, now a respected trainer and speaker, would often point to him and say, "That's not just a horse. That's the one who changed everything." One autumn night, as stars blinked awake in the wide Texas sky, Natalie sat in the grass beside him. Her hand rested gently on his back. "You saved me too," she whispered. And maybe, just maybe, Maverick already knew. Because sometimes, the loudest stories aren't the ones shouted from podiums or printed in headlines. Sometimes, they're the quiet, unshakable truths whispered between a girl and her horse.